What's up? This is Nick and Purjeet.
And this is On Soccer. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of On Soccer. Today we have a very interesting guest, and I actually brought my sunglasses over today, which you guys might be asking, why did I bring them? Well, it's because our guest has a very bright future, and he's someone that we can say is a scholar of the game, which you can't say about many people our age. So I'm very interested to get into this. Today we have the president of the club soccer program at University of Michigan, Martín Grosman. How are you doing, Martín?
I'm doing all right, fellas. Thank you for having me.
Hey, we're so excited to have you. So we'll get right into it. So just to start off, we'd love to just hear about your soccer origin story. How'd you get into the game, kind of your background with the sport?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'll start. My family is all from Buenos Aires, Argentina. So my mother and my father, they immigrated to the United States, and I was born in upstate New York, moved to Champaign-Urbana, the college town of the University of Illinois when I was young, and played for a small club in Champaign called Illinois Football Club for a couple of years. Obviously, my parents are both PhDs, and so they always wanted me to focus on my academics and things like that. But I really loved the game, and I loved kind of being active. I had a lot of friends in town that played soccer, and so for me, that was something that I really enjoyed. And so I played that up until U15. I went to a high school that was a 5-year program called Uni, and so you start as an 8th grader, but as an 8th grader, you can't play varsity sports or JV or anything quite yet. You have to be a freshman. And so I went to Uni, and the summer after my 8th grade year, right before kind of being eligible to play in high school, I actually suffered a fracture to a spinal vertebrae that kind of served as like the beginning of the end of my playing career. So I'm sure you guys remember Zuniga's tackle on Neymar back a couple years ago that put him out with a back injury. It was pretty similar to that. And so I bounced around from doctor to doctor for about a year or two. I was wearing a brace in high school that went all the way down from my waist up to my neck. And so it was this thing that basically over the course of 5 months, I had like re-injured myself 5 separate times trying to get back into it. And at some point it was like, all right, this isn't going to be the path for me. And so I spent basically the next year on the bench of my high school team, kind of watching and like maybe a little bit masochistically, like dangling what I wanted most right in front of me, right? Like sitting on the sidelines and watching and trying to hope that would maybe speed up my recovery. But at a certain point, a man by the name of Phil Anders, he was the coach of the high school team, wonderful, wonderful person who's known me since I was very little. He basically told me, he was like, yo, like, I don't want to watch you sitting here. It's sad. Like, we got to get you involved and do something. So I kind of came on and started assisting him in some capacity. And over the course of the next year or two, I kind of moved into an assistant coaching role alongside him. And so he is the guy that I largely attribute probably being one of the most influential people for me in my life and my career, because he's the guy that changed it. You know, he's the guy that took something that I thought was the end of the road and to entirely, create this new path that I could then find creativity and find involvement in the sport with. And so through that, I started doing a little bit of coaching. It was nothing terribly formal, but it was just like, kids that were mostly my age and working with them. And we had some wonderful successes, I think, with the team, and it was good. And so I came to college, I came to the University of Michigan. Obviously, as studying mechanical engineering, which is a demanding field to be in, but I was very determined, obviously, to like stay involved in that game, the game that I loved so much. And so for me, I knew that we had a club team here on campus, and so I went to tryouts the first day of tryouts, and I walked up to the then head coach and I said, hey, here's kind of my story. I did this in high school. I would love to keep doing it in college. What do you think? And he kind of looked at me as this like incoming freshman. He was like, all right, dude, so here's what I need. I need you to get me a recommendation letter tomorrow, and I need you to scout. We were at tryouts. There were about 150 players there. So like, I need you to scout your top 6 players that you would sign from this group of 150, right? And so it was like, okay. And so I called Phil on the phone. I said, hey, I just went up to the coach. What do you think? Like, can you get me a letter tomorrow? I know it's short notice. And he was like, of course, I got you. So I went back to tryouts. It's 3 days of tryouts. Long story short, out of the 6 players that we signed that year, 4 of them were on my scouting list. And so I think that was maybe enough to convince him that I at least had a good eye for things. And so I then basically joined the club team. And so with the club team, as a younger guy, we had 3 coaches at the very beginning of my first year of the program. And so it was a little bit hard to kind of find a place within them because we had an attacking guy, a defensive guy, a head coach. And so it was mostly like trying to impact things in more unconventional ways that weren't so oriented towards the field. And so I did a lot of kind of miscellaneous things here and there and doing things with media and marketing and stuff like that. And then gradually moved into like increasingly more influential roles. And so I was elected co-president the following year and then reelected this past year. And then, yeah, kind of moving into this, we've had a little bit of a coaching transition throughout the years. So moving into the assistant role. This year it was super exciting. We have a really, really good guy coming on, this Drew Ducker, who's a USSF A licensed coach. He played for the U.S. men's national futsal team in the past, which is super cool. We've got a really exciting and passionate guy, Cal Suleiman, who is going to be working as an assistant with me as well. And then COVID struck, so that kind of takes us to the current day. But it's been an interesting journey, you know. Like, you start off involved in the sport with your own feet, being able to change the course of a match, you know, with your own body and your own ideas, and it shifts to, okay, now you have this vantage point from the sideline. And for me, the unusual thing is, like, typically 15-year-olds don't have back problems, you know, and like I feel like an old man sometimes when I talk about these types of things, but the sideline is kind of where I've started to find my home. So that's a not so brief introduction, but that's a couple of things.
No, Martin, I think the story is like super inspiring. And, you know, the coolest thing I think about it is that, like, sort of the end of one road led you to succeed in a completely different area, which, you know, I think is the coolest thing. So I don't know, one thing about that process that I'm curious about is that, like, how emotionally exhausting was it when, like, your playing career really ended, transitioning to that coaching role? Like, was it something that at one point you felt would, like, never happen? You were just doing, just see what happens, and then you just fell in love with it? Was that what it was like?
Yeah, so I think definitely emotionally exhausting. I think you know, when you're 15 years old, I was like the captain of my club team for 1 year. You know, it was like I liked the leadership of it. I had all my homies were all on the team. You know, like everybody that I like grew up with was doing this game together and playing, and it was a joyful thing, and it was like also kind of a release, right? Because when you're young, you're going to school, you go, and at night, you know, you have training, and then you have games in the weekend, you have tournaments, you're traveling with the boys, you're in the hotel. It's this experience, it's this cultural thing that you kind of grow up with. And obviously with family roots in Argentina, you know, the first game that I vividly remember watching was 2006 World Cup, I think quarterfinal, Argentina, Germany. Cambiaso misses the penalty and gets us knocked out. And, you know, so you grow up with this thing, and then all of a sudden it's kind of yanked away from you. And so I think it's one of those situations where I know when I was writing my applications for colleges, the Common App, I think I chose a question that had to do with, like, what is the moment that you feel like you transition from childhood to adulthood? And I do think that was probably it, that it was like this idea that, you know, hey, I took this thing for granted, and I took very simple tasks for granted, you know, sitting in chairs and being comfortable, like being able to sleep and not have to toss and turn at night, you know, like being able to go to school without a plastic brace around my whole body. And so I think that gave me a lot. And I think that being able to kind of sidestep and find this new avenue is something that has proven to give me much more than I ever could have imagined. And so I think I'm very happy where I am right now. There are definitely times, obviously, where I'm like on the sideline, like, oh, I'm itching to go in and make a tackle or something like that. But I'm starting to kind of unravel this new space, and I'm fascinated by it, and I'm hoping to continue having a future within it. So.
Yeah, and you know, when we've talked in the past, you know, you've said you have some viewpoints on the challenges the U.S. faces as a soccer country, and also the advantages we may have as a country. We would love to, you know, hear about your perspective on those.
Definitely. So I think when it comes to the U.S., so there's two paths that I kind of want to take with this, right? There's one that's more player oriented, and there's one that's more kind of culture, infrastructure, maybe even tactical, stylistic, right? And so I think the first, I'll go with the more structural one, and I think there's a lot of things at play here, right? When you look at soccer as a sport, it's like it's the world's game. It's like something that everywhere across. I'll use Argentina as an example, right? There are people play in alleyways with a crumpled up ball of paper, and they take their shirts off. They use it, or a shoe, and they use it as two posts. And you play with whatever you can, and it's ubiquitous, right? Every single kid starts off with a blood tie and allegiance to whether it's Boca or whether it's River or whether it's Independiente. Like you have some sort of tie that is totally like seared into your blood. And so for kids, they start off playing in an academy when they're U6, right? They basically dream of reaching a certain threshold where they can break into the B team or the first team, and maybe for La Selección. So it's like one of those things where it's part of everyday life, and here it's a little bit tougher. And I think when you look at the amount of athletic prowess the U.S. has across the board, right? You look at the NBA, which is undoubtedly the best basketball league in the world. You look at American football, and there's nowhere else in the world that it's even basically played. You look at baseball, and there's some countries that might compete, but it's the MLB. You look at hockey, there's a couple other countries, but the NHL is where it's at. And so it's like, and then you look at the MLS, and it's tougher. And I think part of that, there's a lot of different reasons, but part of that comes down to the spread, right? Here, there's so many different things you can do as a kid. When you guys were younger, I'm sure, you might have had the chance to play baseball, and you might have had the chance to play soccer. And there's so many kids that play, they end up being a kicker for a football team when they were a center back in high school, and they chose that path. There's a lot of different crossroads, whereas in other countries, in Argentina, believe it or not, it's like you play soccer or handball or maybe basketball, and that's it, right? And so one of the problems is that funnel. And so I think one of the things that you look at when you look at different international setups, right? If you look at Spain, since in the last decade, Spain is a team that has this style of being very possession oriented, right? They have these maestros, these artists. You look at Argentina. Argentina is all about the number 10. It's all about the enganche. It's all about Maradona. It's all about Messi. It's all about, you look at how many players do we have that can fill that role right now that don't even make the team, because you have one of the greatest players, if not the greatest player of all time, consistently in that role, right? You look at Brazil, and it's about Joga Bonito, and it's like all this flair and all these tricks. When you look at, or you look at the Dutch, right? The Dutch is like a history of tactics and all these different things. You look at the American setup, and one of the things that I struggle to find is that stylistic component. It's that, what is our brand? What is the thing that is going to push? What is our, what is our, we have a title that's U.S. men's national team or U.S. women's national team, which obviously they do a lot better for themselves than the men's do, at least in the last couple of years. And so what is the subtitle under that, right? Like what defines our group? And I haven't seen that yet. And so for me, one of the things that I think about is like, okay, we have this pipeline that's like split off in so many different ways, right? And you have a fan base in the United States. You have your soccer fanatics like ourselves, right, who maybe watch European football or different things. But then you have those that aren't convinced by the sport at all, right? You have these people that are like, oh, it's, there's all this diving, and it's kind of for like, weak kids, and, all these different, there's a lot of stigma around it that doesn't exist in other countries. And so when you look at, all these track athletes that are playing and these football athletes, and you think to yourself, okay, well, we have a population that's so massive compared to, say, a country like Croatia that makes the World Cup final with however few million people that live in Croatia, right? Like, we have so many people at our disposal. The question becomes, how, from a from a coaching standpoint, can you create that identity that the U.S. public that might not already be invested in the sport can buy into? And that, I think, is, to me, the challenge of the next 20 years, 30 years for this group, because I think obviously the World Cup is coming in 2026, and eyes are on the U.S. for that. But my thought is this, right? People love the hard-hitting nature of American football. They love watching tackles. They love big guys and strength, and they like speed when you look at runners and things like that. They love the instant gratification and the frequent gratification of basketball, where it's like you're scoring points every couple of seconds, right? And then you look at soccer, and they don't really have either of those two things. And so for me, if my thought process is, if it were up to me, I think the U.S. needs to brand themselves as the single most athletically gifted soccer country in the world. And I think for me, we've already seen that there are certain players. If you look at Pulisic, if you look at Tyler Adams, if you look at Gio Reyna, you look at Weston McKennie, that are breaking out in Europe, right? But the thing that the U.S. has to offer is just like this wealth and this base of athletes. And so for me, if you can create a culture around, you look at like Bielsa's Leeds, right? That they just run, and they press, and they don't even necessarily focus too much on defending. Their whole goal is we want to score more than the opposition. And if that means that we have to win our games 4-3 for the rest of the EPL season, they're going to do it. And so you look at when you create this culture and this kind of style for the U.S. men's national team, in an idealistic world, the team that I'm putting together is a team of athletic freaks, right? Guys that, you have to create your own style, but guys that are just, like, your center backs are going to be 6'5" tanks. They're going to be very, very fast. They're going to be big guys that are going to make crunching tackles. You have very, very quick wingers. You have big guys like DK that's up top, right? And like, you think if you pluck all these players from Europe, right, you have like a guy that's like, say, Arturo Vidal and Raja Nangolan in the midfield, guys that are just thugs, that are gonna be nitty gritty and fight for the ball. That is something that I think you put that in front of an American audience, and America is all about, the fight. That's the big thing here. It's like, we want to see players fighting. And so if you create that, I think you start to generate more interest, and you see people that are like, oh, hey, that tackle was brutal. Like, this is kind of fun to watch. And for us that we enjoy maybe the finer things a little bit more, we're already in it. We're already invested. But in order to get like that movement together, you need to appeal to those that I guess aren't so much kind of ingrained in that mentality. So I think those are just some of the things that I think that it for U.S. men's soccer, like, is an opportunity. And I think in terms of advantages, right, we talked about that too. Like, we have so many young athletes. If you look at your high school, how many kids went and played basketball or played American football or played any of these other sports? If they had all been funneled into soccer, think about the base of people that we would have to work with. It'd be immense. And so I think that's kind of a couple of ideas that I think the U.S. really could leverage in the future.
For sure. So Martín, let me sort of like here. So a couple of things. So first, about like the specific culture of getting those like nitty gritty tackles. I never really thought about like integrating an American audience that way. So that's a very interesting way to think about it. But let me challenge you a little bit on like the tactical identity you're talking about for like other countries. So like obviously like in Brazil you have Joga Bonito, as you said. Argentina has their own like number 10 role. So I would argue that pre-2018 there was somewhat of a specific culture to the U.S. men's team. I think they were a team that was known for like comebacks, team that was known to fight till 90 minutes. And, like a quote that I mentioned in last podcast, that's like probably my favorite quote ever that I'll probably mention in every podcast, but it's that culture eats strategy every day for breakfast. And I think that before 2018, the U.S. definitely had that team culture that sort of identified them. Now, in terms of sort of like a tactical identity for sides, like I get that like Brazil, Argentina, like Germany, I think you could argue also, they all have, or Spain too, they all have a specific style of play they've always been known for. But like I don't know, like feel free to counter this. But like countries like, for example, like France or like England, like I don't think in this like decade even they have a specific identity or style. But regardless of that, they still like are prominent football nations. They make it far in like the tournaments. So I guess my question to you is, how important is it for us to develop our own sort of like tactical, nuanced style of play? And is that more important than just getting the actual culture and mindset of U.S. soccer back, if that makes sense?
Sure, it's a great question. I think they're very intertwined, but I think the U.S. to me is a country that doesn't like not qualifying for the World Cup, right? Is a country that wants to be first in everything. We're very competitive people. We have this spirit about us, right? And so I think for me, the two things are very intertwined. And I think less so of maybe a tactical stance, but it's more of the persona that each individual needs to embody on the field that we are putting out there. They need to be fighters. That's my main point, right? I think, for example, Weston McKennie is a great example of that, right? He is a guy that you can tell he's a workhorse. He's running the whole game, right? He's always making tackles. He's always there. He's nipping at players. And so for me, that's somebody that I can see a crowd getting behind, right? And maybe they don't understand, or they don't, have as much appreciation or even care about some of the more nuanced things, like, positional play, or any of the things that like the Spanish setup or any of the German setups are working with, right? Or like how to position your players in a way such that triangles kind of organically appear on the field. But instead, it's more just like when we go to watch the men's national team, we know we're going to see fighters. We know we're going to see guys that are going to make tackles. We know we're going to see headers. We're going to see guys that are sweating when they come off the field. And I think that's the big thing is people want to see the more physical side to the game, the more energetic side to the game, and I think the more high scoring side. Because I think for me, Mexico, for instance, is a very, very strong team. Canada is a team that's kind of on the rise, obviously, with Alphonso Davies, who's probably going to be a world beater for the next decade. Those games cannot be rivalries for us, is what I think. I think that for us, those have to be games where we go in and we're like, we have the base, we have the infrastructure, we have the coaching, we have the population, that those should be intense games that we are expected to win every single time. They can't be rivalries. They have to be games that you're going to go in and you're going to win. And I think, you look at a team like Chile, for instance. Chile is a team that I'm not terribly fond of because I attended the 2015-2016 Copa America final in East Rutherford, New Jersey, when Messi skied the penalty. Probably the most painful moment of my live soccer viewing life. But that team, all they do is just these tackles, and they're sprinting the entire game, and they train in the mountains, and it's like that. I think is an identity and a brand that I think is super important to maybe develop and to I think that's something that the American public would find easier to latch onto than some of these more nuanced things that maybe teams in Europe are doing and can make their identity based off of.
Yeah, and I think with Berhalter coming in, he's put in some tactics where in certain instances the goalie is ahead of the two center backs and the center backs are standing by the corner flags. I personally don't think that we have the style of player to succeed in that style of play. Do you think the U.S. can that's more of when he's trying to play more of a possession based, or even in his first few games, the right back would come in and play as a defensive midfielder when we were in the attack? Do you think that we have the right players for that side of play?
So it's interesting, right? Those two tactics are two separate things. One, the first one I think kind of stems from some of the new goal kick rules that have emerged in soccer, right? So that's something that a lot of people have been talking about kind of in analysis and tactics Twitter, is this idea that you can now pass the ball within your own goal kick zone, the 18-yard box, to start off play. And so what teams are doing is they recede their center backs, they pull them wide, and the idea is to invite the oncoming press. You invite the first line of the opponent, you stretch out the opposition. If they play a high line, for instance, and they bring all of their soldiers into your territory, and you yank their striker deep into the corner flag and you're able to kind of play around them. I'm sure you guys have seen the way that Arteta gets out of the back right now with Arsenal. You have an immense amount of space behind their back line to attack. And if you have a striker, say that's, a speedy guy, let's say Pulisic, who comes in from the wing, or you have Josh Sargent or somebody like that up top that you can play balls into, you really, really yank them towards you and you invite them out. So that's a strategy that is very modern. It's also a strategy that just about most clubs in Europe right now are trying to employ. I'm not opposed to the U.S. trying it out. I think it's something that you have to bring that personality. You have to bring a certain amount of tactical tinkering to the coaching position. When I look at, you mentioned wide backs coming in as central defensive midfielders, I'm a huge fan of that. Actually, that's something that I talked a lot with some of the players at the club team here at Michigan, with some of the new coaches that are coming in, about employing a system that's basically a 3-2-5 in build-up. And that's something that Pep Guardiola is doing a ton at Man City, where he basically, at some point, he was drawing in Walker and Delph, and then it was Zinchenko, and now it's Mendy into this central defensive midfielder space, and it allows them to play a lot more fluid soccer with 2 10s, basically, with De Bruyne and David Silva pushed up further into the half spaces high up the field. It's fascinating stuff. It's very, very modern. And I think that I don't know so much about the personnel. I don't know so much about whether it's going to work or whether it isn't. I think the adventure, the initiative to try those things is important. But I maintain that for me, I think the thing that you need to start a movement in this country that obviously has already started but needs that continuous push especially leading up to 2026, is you need to focus on the dynamism. You need to focus on, if I'm the coach right now, right, I'm all about pressing. I'm all about pressing with intensity. Not necessarily a high line or a low line. It probably depends on the opposition, but it's intensity, right? It's like you want the crowd to get behind you whenever crowds are back into the stadiums, and that to me is going to get more people interested in the sport, more people invested, more people watching online. And this is maybe rambling a little bit, but then you think about like the infrastructure a little bit too, right? You think about the whole thing going on right now with Peacock, right? With NBC SN, and how people are upset at the fact that they're making it basically just as hard as possible for American fans to watch soccer in this country. Every time that I go visit my family back in Buenos Aires, you go and you turn on the TV and it's the first channel that pops up. And so there are these little things across the board. There's all these arguments about pay for play, right? Like, why do you have to pay $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 for a season with a club or with an academy, when overseas, if they like you, they pay you, so there's these little tiny infrastructural things that are important to think about. I think that the tactics are exciting to watch. I would love to see some of those things, obviously, in the coming years. But I think, again, going back to some of the previous points, when you play a team like Trinidad, and no disrespect to them because they did what they had to on that field, those have to be games that aren't even, they can't even be in question. Those are games that you have to hit out of the park. It's not, are we going to do this specific thing, It's like we have to win those. We have to sweat. We have to grind those wins out. And so, yes, those are kind of some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and then Martin, sort of just like one quick additional thing on this topic. So just in your experience at the Michigan Club men's soccer program, I don't know how much exposure you specifically had to like the NCAA official Michigan team or anything, but do you have any specific thoughts about the college pipeline to soccer? Because I think in a lot of ways, obviously in the U.S. it's different than anywhere in the world. So how does that affect our player development for the national team?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I think one of the good things the U.S. Does is they provide a lot of educational opportunities for just about most people that are interested in them, right? There's so many scholarships that allow students that are maybe underrepresented minorities or have financial backgrounds that might be limiting to, if they get to the certain point where they've worked hard enough and they have the grades to show for it, they can go places and they can study and they can do really big things. And I think that is a hugely commendable thing about the United States, and I can't stress that enough. My parents immigrated to this country so my brother and I could get an education, first and foremost. The thing where it kind of confuses me a little bit is this need for these athletes to effectively be distracted by academics. And I know this is kind of a hotly debated thing, but I think, for all the players that don't make it, they now have a undergraduate degree that can then get them a job doing something. And that's wonderful because it's an excellent fallback. But at the same time, during those years where their development is so important, right? When they're 15, 16, 17, 18, going into college, those need to be years that you are spending, if you look at Europe, if you look at South America, these kids are always at the clubhouse. They're always with their friends. They're always playing. They're always watching soccer. They're always, immersed in it. And that's the tender time with your brain as you're developing, that you need to get to that point, right? Because you start to see these starlets that emerge in Europe that are 17, 16 years old, right? I think Mukoko is this guy, I hope I'm not butchering the name, who's 15 years old. He's going to start for Dortmund in the next couple of months. Here, that kid is like still going through high school, taking intro to biology at that age, right? And so my question is, the safety net is there, and it's so valuable, and it might not be there for other countries. But my question is, for some of these players, if you really, really want to be able to compete, is there value in saying, maybe you don't have to go to college. Maybe you don't have to even, graduate high school. I don't know. You look at a lot of the guys, you look at somebody like Carlos Tevez, who grew up in the favelas, basically in Argentina. It's a Brazilian term, but it's like the slums of Argentina. And he ended up being just this pit bull of a player, total legend for Argentines everywhere. He's not a brilliant guy in terms of his academics, but he doesn't have to be, right? And I know there were years ago, I saw some article about how, like, maybe it was Frank Lampard or somebody like that, who was like one of the smartest players ever because he knew some Latin. And I was like, why does that matter, right? Like I don't care if he knows Latin. I care if he can see the pitch. I care if he has the motivational intuition to move to be the captain for his team. And so my where I start to doubt things is like, why do our players have to go through all of these stages and then get drafted into the MLS at the age of 22, at the age of 23, when these guys across overseas are already involved in the second team at the age of 17? You know what I mean? And my question is, like, there's obviously a ton of players in Europe who don't make it. There's players in Argentina, who in Brazil and in South America, who don't make it. And that's where I kind of lose it, right? Where it's like, I don't necessarily know what you do with that. And that's something that the US obviously has to counter. But I think if you want to be able to compete, the need for that educational component and making these kids, even the kids obviously that are going to school here that are in the D1 program, getting their degree, for some of them might be really important. But for some of them, if they really want to go to the MLS, I'm going to be totally honest, I don't care if you're going to those classes and you're excelling and you're whatever. You have to focus on your craft, right? And so I think there's an interesting kind of duality there, but I think it's a tough question, and it's another thing obviously that sets the US apart, but further complicates the picture. So.
Got you. And then quick side note before we move on as well. I think that's a very interesting take, and people don't really look at that process that intricately, which I really think it needs to be like analyzed by more people because it's so important for our future. But I don't know if you're a very avid show watcher or if you use Netflix a lot, but there's a show called El Apache about Carlos Chavez. It's like about his childhood in the slums and how he came up. So if you haven't seen it, a really good watch for those who are listening as well.
I'll definitely check it out.
And we had a talk with his name is Daniel Proch. He went to Duke and he plays in USL now. But he was very passionate about how in the college season, the spring and the winter is basically just like they do nothing. Like, you can play pickup maybe, but like guys don't show up. And I was so surprised at a school like Duke that, is a pretty successful college soccer school. And now he's playing in USL and he's like, I didn't really even have the chance. They didn't have much of an MLS draft my year. So I didn't really have much of a chance to make it to the MLS. But then you look at some of our best players, like Dempsey played 3 years of college soccer, which is just like, I don't know. It's just like it's a confusing thing where some players it works out and they play 3 years. Like Graham Zusi was on the World Cup roster in 2014, played 4 years of college soccer at Maryland. And then there's players that will play 4 years, they're 22 and they can't even make a USL team because it's so much harder now to go from college to the pros.
Well, I think it's interesting, right? So one of the other elements to this is like the academy setup here in the States. And frankly, I'm not the most knowledgeable on the setup, but what I do know is that if you have a guy that's, say, like in the Philadelphia Union B team as a 17-year-old and he's like trying to figure out what college to go to, I don't see him going to, even if it's a top tier program like Virginia or something, I don't see that as a good move for that player. I think for them, if you are just totally surrounded by football, then that is going to cultivate your ability much more, again, in those tender years of development. And if you're 17 and you're surrounded by guys that are getting national team caps, that's got to be more valuable than spending half of your year playing and half of it playing pickup, like you mentioned. And I don't want to indict any of the collegiate programs here in the States. There's tons of fantastic, unbelievable players throughout the system. But I think it's a shame that there aren't pipelines for these players. If you're 17, right, or you're 18, and you're going to college, you have to make a declaration pretty quickly as to what you want your major to be, right? That's a thing in the United States. You have to decide pretty fast. You have to be like, oh, I'm going to be an engineer. I'm going to go into computer science. I'm going to do business. I'm going to do communication, psychology, whatever. And I don't see why that can't be the case for athletes, right? I might be mistaken here, but LeBron, I'm pretty sure, went either straight from high school to the league. So it's like that needs to be a thing that's possible. And I'm sure maybe it's happened, but maybe not. And I think the whole idea, right, of the draft is another really interesting concept that I think is supposed to level the playing field a little bit, right? It's supposed to let teams that maybe don't do so well in the previous year have good young players that can bring them up. But I think it's like if you have the system in Europe where it's like you have scouts that are looking for the best talent, even if you're 15, you're 16, you're 17, you join an academy, eventually you get your first contract. There are that skips those 4 years you have to spend in college. I think it seems like it's a more effective system, and the U.S. is all about doing things differently, right? It's the customary system, not the metric system. It's like that's the U.S. It's like a brand thing. And it's one of the greatest things about this country. It's also one of the biggest downfalls. And I think, that is something that needs to maybe be considered. Because I look at, again, some of the guys like you mentioned who are in college, and it's like you could be probably either riding the bench or starting for an MLS team or USL team and be there already and start your career. So I think that's something to perhaps reevaluate or consider. But again, it's all very theoretical.
Got you. And then sort of like transitioning on the topic of player development, but slightly different area. So talking about your experience specifically, so like I thought the story about the scouting was very interesting when you first talked to the club's men's soccer coach. So I'll ask you this. So if you're scouting like, you know, a training session or players right now for the team, what are the top 3 sort of characteristics that you would look for them?
It's a good question. So I think for me personally, as a young coach, one of the biggest emphases that I like to place is developing smarter players. I know this kind of contradicts some of the things I had mentioned about athletic freaks in the beginning, but with my team specifically, what I like to see is intelligence. And so the first thing that I think I look for, it's very easy to be wooed with tricks and flicks, with different things like that. Obviously, there's technical things that need to be there, right? If you see a guy that actually, you know, you can tell the guy can strike the ball properly. You can tell that he has control over his movements, different things like that. Sure, those are all fantastic things. But intelligence is the thing I think that really transcends all of that. And I think that's probably my number one is somebody that has their head up all the time, right? So there are certain things back at uni with the high school team that we did a drill called the color drill. It was probably my first favorite drill that I ever made. It's a very simple drill that is all about looking, is all about scanning. It's all about updating your mental map of the field as things are happening on the pitch and checking your blind side and different things like that. And that to me is the sign of somebody who is going to be able to grow, is going to be able to adapt because they're taking in information, right? There's so many different signals and things going on in any given soccer match that if you are able to take in more of it than your opponent, you know more about what's happening. You know the position of the players and you can react quicker. And that is somebody that we can work with, right? That we can cultivate some of the other things. I think that would be the first priority. I think another thing is these are kind of all intangibles, but I think ownership is a really important thing. This is off the top of my head, but I think, you know, you want somebody who takes results a little personally. You want somebody who has the competitive edge, somebody who, you know, when you set up a tryout for 150 students who would have a whole range of playing ability, the players that rise as leaders and the players that demand things from their opponent, from their teammates, are the ones that stand out very quickly. And so that's something that is sometimes easy to discern, sometimes tougher, because you also have players that lead by example, right? We have my co-president for the past 2 years, Ryan O'Mara, is a student here at the university. He is a guy that leads by example. He is one of the smartest people I've met at the school. He is involved in a ton of different things on campus. At tryouts, when I saw him, I would not have maybe picked him to be the immense leader that he is, because he's maybe a little more introverted. He's a little bit more he's a more cognitive guy. He thinks more, you know, he isn't so as vocal, but man, the guy like leads by example. He makes the tackles from the front line. He's somebody like that, and you need that type of player in your team. I think you asked for 3. I'm trying to think of a third one. I think technical proficiency is very important. That's obviously, I think, one of the things that scouts are often told is very, very easy to discern pretty quickly. You know kind of when a player can play and when they can't to a certain degree. There's also certain players that have a bit of awkwardness to them that maybe you would discount initially, but shouldn't. You know, I was watching some highlights of a guy, Calvin Stangs, who plays for AZ. He's a 20-year-old, I think, Dutch guy who was linked with Barcelona for about 5 minutes this summer. And I watched some highlights of his last night. And he's a little ganglier, right? He looks kind of like a playmaking Ousmane Dembele, kind of like a longer guy. And maybe you watch him maybe for the first couple of minutes and you're like, he looks a little awkward. But then you see he's just truly brilliant. He's making passes that are like 1% passes and he's completing them. So I think that's perhaps a third thing to consider. But one thing I guess I'll mention on that front too, and this comes with obviously like us as we watch guys like Brennan Aronson or we watch guys that are young in the U.S. setup, is this idea of variance and this idea of like regression to the mean, where it's very, very easy to see one glimpse of something and get very, very excited about it and think like, oh, you know, Tyler Adams scored in a Champions League semifinal, like that he's the greatest player ever for the United States. Like people are going crazy and making compilations on YouTube and stuff like that. People are going nuts. And I think that fervor is important, right? It's a very, very exciting time for young players in Europe for the United States. At the same time, when you're scouting those players, when you're looking at those types of guys, like you have to understand statistically that if they have an excellent performance one day, the odds, statistically speaking, are that they are going to not perform as well in the subsequent matches, right? If we have a guy, you know, there's countless examples of this, right? Like you look at a guy like Kai Havertz that just signed for Chelsea, who played not super well in his first outing and then went and scored a hat trick. And then it's like you see the reactions online, everybody's so reactionary. It's like, oh, he's terrible, like he's so nonchalant. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, this dude's insane, like he's gonna bag us 20 goals and 20 assists this year. You have to be wary of the fact that those performances are going to oscillate. And so I think when it comes to a scouting perspective, right, you look at Weston McKennie in his first game for Juve. All the compilations on YouTube were like the couple of very, very excellent things he did, but they're not showing the average stuff or the less impressive side of things. And so that builds up this image where it's like, oh, we are raising our expectations for these players. It's the same thing with scouting, where you see a guy do something excellent and then they maybe do something that's less desirable. You have to temper your expectations. You have to be mindful of those things so as to not be too overconfident or totally overvalue or undervalue a player. So things to obviously keep in mind.
Yeah, and when you mentioned Tyler Adams, I thought of, you know, Zach Steffen started for Man City the other day.
Yeah.
And he touched the ball like 20 times but didn't make a single save. But they're praising him, oh, he's the best American goalie ever. And it's like, he didn't really do anything. Like, of course he had a 90% passing rate, but he didn't like make a save or save them or like contributed really to them winning the game. But like, they praise him on Twitter. Are you able to, you talk about analyzing matches and I see your tactic board in the background. Can you casually watch a match now? Or is it all?
Yeah, so I'll speak really quickly to the Steffen thing. I thought it was interesting. I saw a guy on Twitter, John Muller, who posted a video that got a lot of controversial comments, I guess, in the the subsequent kind of discussion. But he basically was talking about how he thought that Zach Steffen was basically awful in the game. He had like that one shot that went in, and he was like, oh, his stance was not wide enough, such that the best keepers have wider stance and they're able to get down and they're able to instead of having to take one step to the left and then come back to the right, you can just spring off and he should have made that save. And people are trashing him saying, oh, it's one game, it's one sample. And so it's the same idea where it's like you have such a small sample size, you have to expect that his first game or whatever, like he's going to have good moments, he's going to have bad moments. We can't make an evaluation off of that. You can't make some sort of declarative statement like, oh, he's the greatest American keeper of all time off of that little thing. But anyway, I think with regards to watching games, yeah, I definitely think for me, there's kind of a switch that I can kind of flick on and off when it comes to watching games, where it's either like I am going to purely enjoy this. I'm not as interested in understanding it. I'm not as interested in learning from it. I just want to watch and sit back with a drink in my hand and relax on my couch. I've done enough homework today. I don't want to be cognitively engaged. And then there's another kind of phase where it's like, I think maybe more intermediate, where it's like, okay, I know there's, say, this one player that I'm interested in, or this one setup, right? Let's say the back line, but I'm really interested in how they behave. And one of the things that a coach when I was very young told us is he said, when you guys watch soccer, you can't afford to just watch the whole game. You have to watch the player that plays in your position. And that's kind of the intermediate stage where it's like, if I'm watching Chelsea as a U.S. men's national team fan, I might only watch Pulisic, right? And I might only look to see what does his movement look like? How is he playing the offside line? How is his, release time when he's finishing, different things like that. There's, I think, a third tier where it's like, I'm trying to produce a match analysis of this. I'm looking at things, I'm tagging things, I'm annotating things, I'm writing things down. I'm taking screenshots and putting them in a little PowerPoint where I figure out how are they building up? How are they, how do they look coming out of the back? How are they looking in possession, out of possession, in transitions? And that's maybe like the third stage. And so I think you kind of pick which one you want to do, and it kind of maybe depends on how interested I am, maybe like intellectually in the game, or how much I want to just kind of kick back with my friends and enjoy it.
Got you. And then Martín, I think we're nearing the end of our time, but before we do, just a couple quick questions specifically just about like your style and like what you're into. So, what is like a list of managers or coaches in the game that you really look up to, you really think that you developed your style after, or you want to like sort of be like when you're older or even now?
I think there's a lot of big name guys out there that I am very impressed by for different reasons. I think right now Bielsa has a lot of attention towards him because of his whole story and Spygate and all these things that got him a lot of attention. But I think his obsessiveness is something that I really, really like, right? He is a guy that knows more about the teams that he's going to face than the teams know about themselves, right? And I think that's very, very commendable. There's stories about him walking into interviews with a match analysis for every single game that the team that he's interviewing for played in the previous year. And the board has no other choice but to hire the guy because it's like, all right, I mean, like, what question are we going to ask you that you don't know how to answer? Yeah. I think a guy like Jurgen Klopp is fascinating because he is just, you watch their like inside training videos on YouTube, and it's like everybody's hugging him. Everybody's hugging the guy. Has these like pearly whites. He's smiling all the time. He just radiates this joy. And obviously they have these performance metrics and he demands a lot from his players and he's very animated on the sidelines. But the familial kind of dynamic that I think he's fostered at Liverpool is very, very interesting.
Like a team dad almost.
Totally. I mean, and that's something that you have to, there's all sorts of coaches that talk about this, right? That as a coach, you have to be a tactician, you have to be a fitness guy, you have to be a psychologist, you have to be a fatherly figure. You have all these different roles, and it's like a Swiss Army knife where you have to basically pull out different things at different moments and figure out, I have to mediate this conflict, I have to boost the performance of this player, I have to, you know, be empathetic towards this one, or I have to be vulnerable and show the team that maybe there's a moment, you know, if something crazy happens that the season is over and nobody knows how to explain it, then maybe I don't have the answers and maybe I'm just as vulnerable as you guys are, right? And so that's something that's very interesting there. I think obviously for me, Pep Guardiola is the guy that for me tactically is most fascinating. I followed a lot of Manchester City's kind of dynamics here and there. I think Cholo Simeone is, I mean, just a motivator who is fascinating to watch on the sidelines too. There's a whole wealth of people. I think Gasperini this past year was super interesting to watch with his Atalanta setup and, you know, figuring out how to, you know, he was just overloading the flanks at all times. There were 4 players in the flanks, seemingly like both flanks, and it was just like Gomez in the middle. And that was super fascinating to watch. And obviously like with an underdog story there too. So I think there's so many different people. And I think I wouldn't necessarily say I have one idol, but I think all of these coaches present different things that are important to take away. And I would say one other coach from outside of soccer is Greg Popovich. I grew up as a Spurs fan. I didn't watch all that much NBA, but as an Argentine, Manu Ginobili, you know, made my ties to the Spurs. And Greg Popovich is very, very well known for being probably one of the greatest kind of coaches in any sport in all of history. And there are so many stories of him, like I think when like the Spurs were in the finals against the Heat, and I think they were maybe up or something, and they ended up losing, the way that he responded to those moments, I think was very, very interesting. So I think again, lots of different influences.
Yeah, and I think me and Prajit, you know, we kind of found out about, you know, the men's soccer team and you specifically over the summer when you guys did those player takeovers on Instagram, which we really enjoyed. And, you know, in yours specifically, you mentioned a couple of books, you know, about tactics or just soccer in general. Can you recommend a few soccer books for us and our listeners?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously some of the classics, right? So there's like zonal marking I really enjoyed, inverting the pyramid I very much enjoyed. Soccermatics by David Sumter is fascinating, especially for those that are interested in kind of the more analytical side. There's a book, Football Hackers by Christoph Biermann that I recently read that gives an idea into some stuff like packing and XG and things like that. I think some that I'm kind of into right now, I'm very interested in some of the like print magazine stuff. It's less tactically focused, it's more cultural, but there's some good like scouting publications. There's some good kind of indie magazines that have cool artwork and stuff that are related to the sport that are really interesting. There's a book I'm reading right now called Football Periodization. It's by Raymond Verheyen, I think. I'm going to butcher that last name, but that's been very interesting. It's like a textbook on that philosophy. And I think there's a lot, you know, there's some that are more culturally focused. There's a book called Among the Thugs that I have on my shelf that I haven't read yet, but I think is going to be very, very good. There's obviously Soccernomics is a book that was written by a guy that now is a professor here at Michigan.
Yep.
There's a lot there's a lot to consume. And so what I will add on top of that too is the blog space is very interesting. So there's a lot of people that are writing a lot of really interesting things. So Spielverlagerung is a personal favorite of mine. That is, I don't know if you guys know of Renee Maric, who's a 27-year-old assistant coach now for Borussia Mönchengladbach. He started off writing for this blog, and he's 27 years old in the top flight of Bundesliga. And you can go back and read his articles on, the advantages of playing in a 3-4-3 or positional play or any of these different things on this blog that date back for years. And so a lot of those more kind of independent efforts are all very, very interesting too.
And Martin, sort of just to close out, what are your plans after college? Do they involve soccer? Is there any way you're going to integrate soccer in your life in terms of pursuing coaching or anything? Or sort of what are you looking forward to right now after?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm pursuing obviously this mechanical engineering degree. I have my 1 year left to finish everything up. And I think that the analytical side and like the problem kind of deconstruction side of engineering has been very, very interesting and something that I really enjoy. And I think it's something that I want to carry into potentially a career in soccer. I think for me, one of the biggest issues obviously with coaching is that financially it's not the most stable thing. And it is a punt. It is a bet that you have to take on yourself, and you have to basically be comfortable with living within your means for an extended period of time. And when you go to a school like Michigan and you're coming out with an engineering degree, there's a lot of opportunities that might be more lucrative, or a lot of opportunities that might give you a lot more stability early on. And as the son of immigrants, obviously my parents have done extremely well for themselves, but making sure that our roots are firmly planted here and that I can provide for my own family is an important thing, right? And so my kind of idea is I've formulated basically this kind of 10-year plan for myself, where I see myself in technology and engineering for 10 years after graduating. I want to be involved in very, dynamic things and working for good companies that have strong vision and all these, all the buzzwords, right? But at a certain point, I want to be able to have the basis to support whatever family I have or anything, to eventually kind of break off into what could be a field in analytics, but could be a space of coaching. It could be management. It could be owning a club. I think that's kind of always been like the dream for me that I think would just give me the most joy. But I need to build up the basis first to get there. And so I think in that first decade that I obviously have planned out, I might go back to school and get a business degree. I might do these different things, but I know I have to be coaching, and I have to be reading. I know I have to be writing. I have to be I have to build up basically a pedigree on my own, such that if I want to make that transition, I'm an interesting applicant for somebody who might be looking at me. So.
Yeah, we're really excited to see where you go, in the soccer world or whatever you choose to do. And we did this with our last episode with Neil Beathy. Just one piece of advice for our listeners, maybe listeners that are looking to go into coaching or want to go into soccer. One piece of advice you may have for them.
So with our club team in the past 2 years, we established 3 pillars that are important to us. We wanted them to be kind of like these 3 key ideals. And one of them is joy. And I think that is the basis of everything, right? I think for me, it's do what you find joy. Do what you find joy in. Do things that you lose track of time when you do them. If you feel like watching games on the weekend gives you a ton of happiness and gives you that break that you need from your everyday life, do it more, watch unique games, watch leagues that you've never seen before, be invested, get your friends invested, find that joy. And I think for the people that are obviously kind of looking to build up this sport in this country, it's like, get involved with local programs. There's a program all across the country called Top Soccer that has to do with helping children with developmental disabilities learn how to play soccer. Get involved in that stuff, be involved through local clubs and volunteering efforts. Help promote the sport, and if you have a bar, make sure you're showing the Prem on Saturdays, things like that. I think you have to find joy, you have to find ways to build up the sport, and and keep watching soccer. That's the most important thing too, is just keep watching soccer. So.
Wow, that's some great advice, man. We really appreciate it. We love hearing your story. You know how you sort of got where you are. We think that you have some really interesting takes, and it was nice really going into the details with someone that can really talk about it. So thank you for sharing your perspectives with us here today, and it's been a real pleasure having you on, man.
Hey, thank you guys so much. Happy to be here.